Hi, welcome to the channel. When Americans think of some of the deadliest battles in history, many of them will think of Gettysburg, Okinawa, or maybe even Omaha Beach on D-Day. When the British think about the deadliest battles, they think of Passchendaele, the Battle of Britain, or possibly Waterloo or the Battle of Hastings. But the one battle that sticks out probably the most is the Battle of the Somme in 1916, especially the first day, July 1st. Britain sustained 57,470 casualties, which includes killed, wounded, and captured, with over 19,000 of those killed. In the first hour alone, Britain suffered over 30,000 casualties, which breaks down to over 500 men killed, wounded, or captured every minute. Over 3 million soldiers participated in the 4.5-month-long battle, with over 420,000 British Commonwealth casualties, 204,000 French casualties, and over 500,000 German casualties, and over 100,000 war animals such as horses, mules, and pigeons also died during this battle. Today's video comes from the channel The Great War. This is the Battle of the Somme. Most likely, this video is going to label all of the British Commonwealth countries as simply British forces. So for respect of all those countries, I do want to individually name them all. Newfoundland, Canada, South Africa, Scotland, India, Ireland, and of course the ANZACS, Australia and New Zealand. Let's get to it.
The Battle of the Somme was one of the bloodiest of the First World War. From July to November 1916, millions of men struggled to fight in mud, under crushing shell fire, or in a hail of machine gun bullets. The Somme has been a synonym for the futility of trench warfare, but also the subject of fierce debate. Who really won the Battle of the Somme? At the end of 1915, the Allies needed a plan. The Central Powers had smashed the Russian army, finally crushed Serbia, contained Italy, defeated the Gallipoli landings, and stopped the French offensives in the west. At Chantilly, Allied planners decided to use their advantage in numbers and agreed on massive summer offensives for 1916, in the east, in Italy, and in the west. French commander Joseph Joffre decided the attack in the west should come along the Somme River, where the British and French sections of the front met. Since France had a much larger army than Britain, French forces would take the lead in the joint operation. But in February 1916, the Germans struck first at Verdun. The French army held them off, but at great cost, and as the weeks went by, Allied planners were forced to adjust. The partly untested British army would now have to shoulder most of the load on the Somme.
Unlike Germany and France, Great Britain did not have a large standing army because historically, Britain's army has always been small and professional and made up of career soldiers. Britain's Minister of War, Lord Kitchener, actually called for 100,000 volunteers. Within 5 months, over 2 million men actually volunteered. So at the time of the battle, most of the British forces were Kitchener's own, or volunteers. Those volunteers, many of which were actually in PALS battalions, had no combat experience and made up the majority of the British forces in this battle.
What was not clear is exactly what the offensive was supposed to achieve, other than relieving the growing pressure on Verdun. Joffre talked about a breakthrough past Péronne and Bapaume, but the French did not have enough reserves for it. British commander Douglas Haig also had thoughts about breaking out of the German system of fortification after wearing them down, but there weren't any significant communications hubs or industrial targets immediately behind the German line. Haig would later say his goal was only attrition, but this is still debated amongst historians. Other generals were more cautious. British Fourth Army commander Henry Rawlinson wanted to advance in short stages to provoke wasteful German counterattacks. French Sixth Army's commander, General Marie-Émile Fayolle, was frustrated. Do they want to break through? What is the point of this battle? Attrition, they say. Fighting to wear down the enemy is not enough. I think that we simply can't stay inactive in the face of public opinion. General de Castelnau was more pragmatic, as he informed French President Briand that the battle would take the initiative from the Germans, spread out German reserves, and bring fresh British armies into action. The uncertainty stoked tensions. French General Philippe Pétain, in command at Verdun, demanded the British attack, otherwise he might have to give up the city, an exaggeration at best. The British cabinet worried about French recklessness in the face of losses. The French are short on men, but they want to do something to further decrease the number. The French worried that the British didn't have the stomach for a hard fight, despite their suffering at Verdun. What's disgusting is that the British don't give a damn about us. The Allies' method, at least, was more clear. The failed offensives of 1915 showed that infantry attacking without enough artillery was doomed. This time, the Allies planned to blast the German defenses with such weight of fire that the infantry would be able to advance with minimal losses. They would do so behind a creeping barrage to keep the Germans' heads down while the infantry crossed no man's land. Rawlinson wanted to focus the preparatory barrage on the German first line, but Haig insisted that British guns shell the German second line as well, and for cavalry to move up to exploit a possible breakthrough.
So this was Germany's defense in depth. Germany had been on these lines almost 2 years, and they had plenty of time to actually build them up. They had 2 trench systems, with a third that actually was being constructed, and each trench was about 150 meters apart and connected by communication or transverse lines. They also had 40-foot deep dugouts or bunkers that actually had electricity and phone lines. And in front of the first trench system, they had a massive amount of thick barbed wire.
The German defenses, though, were strong. They'd occupied the high ground in 1914, and many units had been there for a long time. They had 2 main lines of defense and were preparing a third behind that. The chalky soil allowed them to dig shelters up to 12 meters deep, protected from all but the heaviest of shells, and their barbed wire was up to 9 meters thick. Their line included several fortified villages and numerous labyrinth-like redoubts. German Second Army commander Fritz von Below planned to defend every inch of ground and retake any trench that was lost. Despite their strong position, the first German line was in plain view of Allied artillery observers, and they had too many troops in the vulnerable forward trenches. So the stage was set for an Allied offensive on both sides of the Somme, a battle that would see the British Army's worst day in history. On June 24th, the Allied bombardment began with a weight of fire never before achieved, over 2 million shells in the first week alone. It impressed, stressed, and sometimes angered German soldiers like Adolf Spemann. The superiority of the enemy is immense. The buggers want to wear us down and smoke us out using only their technical means. It's a lunatic way of war which money and America have created, simply to destroy everything and not to advance with a single man.
That America created? So is he saying that those rounds were from the United States? Or I'm not sure why he said America. And out of the 2 million shells that were shot in that first week, about 30% of those were duds. And out of the 70% that did explode, most of those shells were actually shrapnel shells and not high explosive shells. And a high explosive shell is what you want when you're trying to get through defenses such as barbed wire. The shrapnel shells did not do much at all.
The Allies were indeed superior. There were 26 British divisions with 1,300 guns, 467 of which were heavy, and 12 French divisions with 1,400 guns, including 732 heavies, and 309 aircraft. They faced 8 German divisions with 850 guns, of which just 18 were heavy and 104 aircraft. Some British troops were so confident their artillery had crushed the German positions, they expected to be able to simply occupy the empty enemy trenches. But others, many facing action for the first time, were afraid. Captain Charles May wrote to his wife Bessie, "I do not want to die. The thought that I may never see you or our darling baby again turns my bowels to water. If I die, know through all your life that I loved you and baby with all my heart and soul, that you 2 sweet things were the world to me."
So, I actually know Captain Charles May's story because I watched a documentary or a video a couple of days ago, and they did actually feature him. And considering that we're getting a lot of statistics and numbers about how many people were killed and stuff, I think this might be a good opportunity to try to humanize this battle, just to remind us that, hey, these are not just numbers, these were soldiers, fathers, brothers, uncles, sons. This was one of Captain May's secret diary entries. At the time, Great Britain forbade any soldier from keeping a diary under penalty of court-martial. I don't know why though. If you know, please drop it in the comments. He was actually born in New Zealand, but his family moved to Great Britain in 1902, where he grew up, got married, and he joined the British Army. Unfortunately, on July 1st, he was one of 379 soldiers in his regiment, the Manchester Regiment, to actually fall. Yes. You can find his grave as well as the graves of his comrades at the Danzig Alley British Military Cemetery in Mements.
On July 1st, 1916, at 7:30 a.m., British troops went over the top, straight into a hail of machine gun and rifle bullets. The British artillery barrage had been spread too thin, and there weren't enough heavy or high explosive shells. Not only that, but perhaps 30% of British shells were duds and hadn't even exploded at all. The German wire was mostly intact, and German dugouts mostly untouched. Even the massive underground Hawthorne mine that the British blew brought little results.
They had 19 mines scattered throughout the 18 or 25 kilometer battlefield, with the Hawthorne one, I think, being the biggest.
German troops came up from their dugouts and opened a murderous fire into the British ranks in no man's land. German machine guns and shrapnel cut down the inexperienced British units who walked towards them at a measured pace according to their training, and cut down the experienced British units who used more sophisticated tactics. In most places, the British didn't even get into the German trenches, and where they did, the few survivors were no match for German counterattacks. The Newfoundland Regiment attacking at Beaumont-Hamel, for example, barely made it into no man's land before it was nearly wiped out, suffering 86% casualties in the first 20 minutes.
Just like Great Britain, July 1st was the deadliest day in all of Newfoundland's military history. Of about 800 men in that regiment, I think about 710 were captured, killed, or wounded.
Only in the south did British units manage a reasonable advance, where they had the good fortune of help from French artillery. A British sergeant recalled a typical experience. Away to my left and right, long lines of men. Then I heard the pitter-patter of machine guns in the distance. By the time I'd gone another 10 yards, there seemed to be only a few men left around me. By the time I'd gone 20 yards, I seemed to be on my own. Then I was hit. The French had much more success in the south. They had more heavy guns, had concentrated their fire, and were generally more experienced.
I just want to add that Germany knew that there was an offensive planned. It was pretty obvious. However, they were surprised that the offensive actually came that far down south, so they weren't as prepared.
They also had the element of surprise, since the Germans did not expect the French could mount such a large attack while holding at Verdun. They took the German first line on July 1st, then the second line the next day, advancing up to 7 kilometers and taking 8,000 prisoners. For a moment, it seemed the town of Péronne might be within reach, but the French didn't press their advantage, since army doctrine was now cautious and methodical. July 1st, 1916, was the worst single day in the history of the British Army. 57,000 casualties, with 19,240 men killed, among them Captain Charles May. The French lost about 7,000 killed and wounded, while the Germans suffered just 10 to 12,000. The reasons for the British disaster have been debated, but several aspects are clear. The shelling did not destroy enough wire or dugouts to suppress German defenders, and the rolling barrage moved faster than the infantry could follow. Some British units, though not all, as has become a widespread myth, advanced too slowly, and the men often went to ground once their officers were hit. The British home front was shocked at the scale of the losses. especially as many of the new army's community-based PALS battalions had badly suffered.
Some of these battalions or regiments had between 50 and even 100% casualty rate. You can imagine that many communities were left devastated. They literally lost an entire generation of men. And this is why Great Britain decided to discontinue the PALS program and actually institute a conscription.
July 1st had seen British failure and limited French success, but the Germans were under pressure. Both sides prepared for more fighting. Despite the German success, their commanders were still concerned as they had badly underestimated Allied strength. On July 3rd, General von Below issued a stark order. On the victory of Second Army on the Somme hangs the outcome of the war. The battle must be won by us, despite the momentary superiority of the enemy in artillery and infantry. For now, everything depends on holding on to our current positions at all costs and on improving them with small counterattacks. I forbid the voluntary evacuation of positions. Only over corpses may the enemy find his way forward. Haig briefly considered stopping the offensive and attacking in Flanders, which provoked French fears of weak British resolve. In a heated meeting on July 3rd, Joffre smashed his fist on the table and ordered Haig to attack. London worried that France would collapse without continued help, and so they attacked again on July 14th.
Before the battle, Rawlinson predicted that there would be approximately 10,000 British casualties. And on the night of July 1st, he wrote in his diary that they had sustained about 16,000 casualties. So my question is, at what point in time did all these commanders realize that they had sustained almost 60,000 casualties on July 1st? That's what I want to know.
This time things went better for the Brits, who after a 5-minute hurricane artillery barrage and well-timed rolling barrage captured most of the German second line. Some cavalry even saw action near High Wood, but the Germans forced them to withdraw. Over the next 2 months, the battle then evolved into a series of local British attacks, and both sides funneled in reserves. Given the Russian, Italian, and French Verdun offensives were putting pressure on the Central Powers, and Romania entered the war on the Allied side in August, there was some hope in London and Paris that Germany might crack. The British piecemeal attacks did inflict losses on the Germans, but they were disjointed and only began to shift the balance of attrition in September. Typical of the many smaller actions to capture tactically advantageous villages, woods, or important trenches was the South African Brigade's 5-day stand at Delville Wood, or the Australian 1st Division's capture of Pozières.
It's worth it to note that that battle is the bloodiest day in South African military history.
Many of the assaults failed or broke down into isolated small unit actions in the face of command and control issues once British troops left their own trenches. Still, the British superiority in artillery took its toll. The artillery thumps down onto our positions, shattering the ground and our nerves with it. Thankfully, the British infantry is useless. We can repel their attack with the help of just a single machine gun and a few rifles. But their artillery never stops. They keep pounding us day and night. I really don't know how we're going to survive. The Germans counterattacked hundreds of times to retake every position they lost and reorganize their armies. The fighting was bitter, and both sides regularly shot surrendering enemy. When one falls into enemy hands, no quarter can be expected. Everyone here knows this is the moment of truth, and the bitterness is extreme. Why take prisoners when one has to lead them back through the shelling? The British Army did gain valuable experience and practiced new tactics like better coordination between aviation and artillery, improved communication and logistics, more accurate rolling barrages, and aerial strafing of German trenches. They were slowly learning to deal with Karl von Clausewitz's friction of battle, what to do when your plan goes wrong or you cannot exercise direct control over units in contact with the enemy. The French, on the other hand, didn't have the reserves to exploit their early success, so they conducted smaller attacks to grind down the Germans.
So obviously there were some planes that were a part of this battle, at least in reconnaissance, but at the time, were they any dogfights, or did any of the planes actually drop any bombs on enemy positions, or was that not yet a part of the Air Force's doctrine? If you know, please drop it in the comments.
The much-awaited Somme offensive had bogged down into piecemeal fighting over the summer, but that all changed on September 15th with the arrival of a new weapon on the battlefields.
Tank.
The British had been working on a weapon to break the trench deadlock for some time, an armoured vehicle on tracks they referred to as a water tank for secrecy. British High Command decided to commit its 49 available Mark I male and female tanks to the assault focused on the villages of Flers and Courcelette. Many British soldiers were as surprised as the Germans. Just before H hour, we heard an unbelievable racket, and I remember saying to myself, what the devil is that? And the tanks appeared, one in our front, one farther away. We were all absolutely stunned. We didn't know what they were because no one told us anything about them. It was a stupefying vision. The panicked Germans fled like rabbits. British forces captured Flers while Canadian troops stormed Courcelette and took it at the bayonet, a local but limited success. The tanks, however scary they were, proved not to be game changers. There were too few of them, most of them suffered mechanical breakdowns or got stuck before getting into action, and they proved vulnerable to German artillery.
Not to mention that I think they went about 2 or 3 miles per hour, and I think by the end of the first afternoon, all of them had broken down or been destroyed.
Some British officers felt an opportunity had been wasted by giving away the secret weapon before there were enough of them to make a difference. The grinding British attacks continued, with another large operation on September 25th bringing Thiepval under British control, an objective of the very first day. But as usual, there was another imposing German position waiting right behind it, in this case the Schwaben Redoubt. Parallel French attacks also made some gains in the south. For the men involved, like Dr. Louis Moffret, these minor footnotes of history meant a lifetime of trauma. Images of the Priez farm obsessed me. Bodies piled up in the sap trench filled with poison gas. Dead and wounded scattered pell-mell, the lack of water that even prevented us from washing our hands, the smell of blood, urine, and shit, the lightly wounded who crouched on the steps of the dugout, the dark masses of flies that covered the ceiling. I'll never forget it. Once again, the decisive Somme offensive had come to a standstill at the end of September. And once again, the French grew frustrated with what they saw as British hesitation. Joffre again pressured Haig to attack, but this time the British won't launch any more general assaults. They felt the troops were exhausted, and the fall rains have turned what was a muddy battlefield into a brown swamp. Smaller, costly attacks for tactical improvements, though, continue. The Canadians, for example, take Regina Trench after several failed attempts, but the 22nd French-Canadian Battalion is nearly wiped out. To close out the battle, Scottish units also managed to take the village of Beaumont-Hamel in November, yet another objective originally planned for July 1st. After 4.5 brutal months, the Battle of the Somme was over. It may have been the bloodiest battle of the First World War, and one of the most controversial. Casualty figures have been part of the debate. Today, most historians accept 420,000 British Empire troops and 204,000 French soldiers were killed or wounded, with German losses between 430 and 500,000. Some have claimed German losses were over 600,000, but this was likely to justify the idea of the Somme as a successful Allied battle of attrition. And the German army did suffer terrible losses on the Somme. Hindenburg and Ludendorff both said so after the war. Some have called the battle the muddy grave of the German army, or even Germany's Verdun. Despite the heavy Allied losses, the British could replace casualties more easily than the Germans could, and the British army learned much from the battle as part of its so-called learning curve. The battle did have an impact on German morale as well. Allied superiority in men, artillery, and aviation didn't result in a breakthrough, but for the first time, many Germans, from regular soldiers to senior officers, began to doubt that Germany could win the war. Psychological casualties amongst the Germans tripled during the battle. The Germans concluded that although the battle was a Materialschlacht, what really mattered was morale and fighting spirit. But the attrition argument has weaknesses. The Allies lost more men than the Germans, and the Germans actually suffered fewer losses overall in 1916 than they did in 1915.
So if you estimate German losses at the high end of the spectrum of 600,000 casualties, then it is about even with what the Allies actually lost. It really isn't that big of a difference.
The German army also grew in 1917, though it lost somewhat in quality. Although the Germans did stop their attacks at Verdun, they also still had the ability to transfer 15 divisions east during the Somme offensive to deal with Russia's Brusilov offensive and Romania's entry into the war in August. If measured by the standard of Haig and Joffre's alleged desire for a breakthrough, the Somme was an Allied failure. They only penetrated about 10 kilometers deep and 25 kilometers wide into the German lines, and captured no operationally significant objectives. And when they did advance, they couldn't get through the German defenses faster than the Germans could prepare new ones just a bit further back. Given the Allies used 106 divisions on the Somme and the Germans only 57.5, it cannot be said that the Allies succeeded in applying their superior force effectively. From the German point of view, they'd prevented a breakthrough and stopped an offensive of 2.5 million Allied troops using just 1.5 million of their own. Even so, after the battle, General Haig declared victory, but not just yet. The enemy's power has not yet been broken, nor is it yet possible to form an estimate of the time the war may last before the objects for which the Allies are fighting have been attained. But the Somme battle has placed beyond doubt the ability of the Allies to gain those objects. The Battle of the Somme wasn't decisive, but the Allies failed to achieve their most important objectives. They did relieve pressure on Verdun, but they didn't break the German army by attrition, and they didn't achieve a breakthrough. The Germans, on the other hand, prevented a breakthrough and inflicted more casualties on the enemy while retaining their ability to move reserves east, a result that can be considered a defensive victory for Germany, even though their overall strategic situation was still bleak.
So here's two thought-provoking questions that I would love to hear answers to in the comments. If Germany had not attacked Verdun and France was able to actually lead this offensive, do you think that the outcome of the battle would have been any different? And do you think it's accurate to say of the British forces that this was a battle where lions were led by donkeys?
The battle also had an impact in other ways. The Germans decided to prepare the shorter Hindenburg Line and to adopt new tactics to conserve manpower. It contributed to the removal of Joffre and Falkenhayn as commanders-in-chief. It led to Germany embarking on an accelerated arms-building program to keep pace with the Allies, and it began the age of armored warfare. The Somme also marked the start of a much more important role for the British Army on the Western Front, and was the first time that British society was faced with the full horror of mass casualties of industrial warfare. That's why more than any other battle, the Somme still dominates British memory of the war more than a century on. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is a production of Real Time History, the only history channel that doesn't flee like rabbits at the sight of a tank.
Thank you guys so much for watching. I know this was a depressing video, but one thing I want to briefly mention is that not only was during the battle the bloodiest day in military history for South Africa, Great Britain, and Newfoundland, it was also the bloodiest day in Australian military history. That day came on July 19th at the Battle of Fromelles. There were over 5,500 Australian casualties. If you did get any value from this video, I would appreciate a like, comment, or a share. Once I film a video about being wounded on the Western Front, specifically at this battle, I'll put it right here. Here is where I'll put Motorhead's 1916, which is a ballad all about this battle. Until then, I will go ahead and put Sabaton's cover of the song right here, lest we forget.